Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation looking at just how far the status of American women changed in the 1920s. And by status, I mean the standing women held in society and what was seen as their roles. Now, the first thing that must be said is that women can't be treated as a homogeneous group. That's a posh word meaning all of the same kind. Just as with men, there were rich women, middle-class women, working-class women, and poor women. There were white women, black women, and women from immigrant families. Women living in cities, women living in rural communities, older women and younger women, and there was every other kind of woman that goes to make up a complex society. That said, there were two things that led women to see themselves differently in the 1920s, and to demand that society see them differently too. The first was that they had worked in wartime factories, proving that they could do jobs, often skilled jobs, previously the sole preserve of men, and do them just as well, I should add. Secondly, in 1918, the 19th Amendment gave women the vote, and with it, political power. They could no longer be ignored. Now, back in peacetime, women, having been given a taste of what could be, were entering the workforce in ever greater numbers. By the end of the 1920s, there were 10 million women in paid employment, an increase of 25%. Women weren't in the workplace on equal terms, though. Many employers welcomed them because they could get away with paying them less. Women may have got the vote, but the Equal Rights Amendment failed. The argument for less pay was that women were still living at home, or else were married, and so in most cases a second wage earner in the household. You wouldn't think that argument would be considered valid, but it was back then. And as you can see from the slide, the Equal Rights Amendment is still being fought for in some American states in this 21st century. But back then, most women were actually prepared to work for less pay. Nevertheless, working women did become more financially independent. Outside of work, women's lives changed in three ways. Like men, some women too had more leisure time and more spending power. And increasingly, more women demanded that they should be free to behave in much the same way as men. They had their role models on the silver screen, and advertisers picked up on the change in expectations, and women were specifically targeted. There were magazines for women which sold in their millions. How did this translate in reality? Well, women's clothes were much freer. They wore them more loosely, and they were more daring too. And short hair became a symbol of the liberated woman. Women started wearing makeup too. Women drove cars, and they smoked in public, which was frowned upon before the war. Also, with contraception more readily available, sex before marriage became much more common, as family planning became more common too. There was a social cost though. Divorces doubled between 1914 and 1929. But the women who pushed the boundaries the most, though, and created the image for all women in the 1920s were the flappers. They were identified by their short, bobbed hair and their short skirts. They really pushed the boundaries. The way they dressed, their makeup, and the way they behaved, challenging convention in every way. They were daring, challenging, and they did lead the way for more change in the way women perceived themselves, first of all, never mind the way society perceived women. Yet the image of the flapper was misleading, and it was far from representing women. They were the exception. At least half of women lived on farms or in rural communities, for one thing, and their lives were as far removed from the flappers in New York or other cities, or even the middle-class women of suburbia, as they could be. For one thing, only 32% of farms had running water, and most, the vast majority, didn't have electricity. So no washing machines, electric cookers, fridges, or hoovers to lighten the chores for them. Add to that the fact that on top of the normal household chores and the heavier responsibility women bore in raising their children, most farming women worked on the farms too. As for African American women, well, they were much more likely to take in washing than to have a washing machine. Whilst in the towns and cities, working class women and more middle class women may have worked, but it was often in low paid jobs like cleaning, dressmaking for working class women, or perhaps secretarial work for middle class women. Better jobs tended to be as clerks or in sales, or else in teaching, librarianship, or nursing. What is more, most working women were single, and working married women still took the leading role in domestic chores, cleaning, cooking, and raising their families. And they raised their daughters to do the same. But surely the statistic that puts the changing status of women in perspective, one that I use a lot, is that 60% of Americans were still living on or below the poverty line. Sadly, nothing much changed for them. So, a good overview for you, I think, of the status of women in the 1920s. Now, don't get me wrong, the flappers were very, very important. They did help change things for women, but we mustn't get carried away. Their impact was longer term. The 1920s, for the overwhelming majority of women, was different. If you want more detail, you'll find a lot more in my ebook on Amazon. I have individual books for each topic on your depth study, but there's also a book covering all 4 topics at a much better price. But those decisions are up to you. For this presentation, it only remains for me to thank you, as I hope I always do, for listening. Cheers.